just tell us who you are and what you do, please.
My name is Tim Phillips, and I'm the co-founder of Beyond Conflict.
Describe to us what Beyond Conflict is. What do you do?
So we're an organization founded 23 years ago with a very simple approach, which is to share experience, to bring in leaders, often former enemies, former negotiators from different sides, to come and share their experience with people who are struggling with change, whether it's from moving from a dictatorship to democracy or from conflict to peace.
Thank you. And you were downstairs involved in a talk where a lot of peacekeepers from around the world had come together. Tell us about what you were talking about.
Well, we were talking about both what are our different organizations bring to peacekeeping or conflict resolution, and how do we differ, and what are some of the lessons learned from our work in the field.
Okay. Well, tell us about some of the different organizations that are involved in peacekeeping.
So we had somebody from the International Crisis Group talking about the work they do in terms of both writing about and trying to prevent conflicts from emerging. There's David from the from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, who was talking about the work he's been doing around the world, particularly with Mark Muller in Ukraine, and the work he did in Uganda, dealing with the Lord's Resistance Army. And then there was David Gilmore with the United Nations Office of Peacekeeping, talking about the work they do. And then, of course, the great statesman Karen Prendergast was the moderator, who was Undersecretary for Peacekeeping at the UN.
And the different organizations, does that fairly represent the different organizations that are going to be involved in peacekeeping?
Yeah, or it's not even just peacekeeping, it's really about conflict management, conflict resolution. For a long time, the work of sort of diplomacy and negotiation was done by governments. And then in the last really 50 to 75 years, you've seen the growth of institutions like the United Nations or the European Union. So you've seen this sort of transformation where states were the main actors in dealing with negotiation, diplomacy, and conflict, to where you had these global institutions or regional institutions. Really in the last 25 years, you've seen this growth, some may say an explosion, of non-state organizations or non-state actors who have really gotten involved. And it's not only because there's a demand for this work, but governments are constrained. They're constrained by politics. They're constrained by, for example, at the UN, trying to get consensus as to whether or not to get involved in a country. The Security Council is infamous for whether Russia or the United States or China don't want to see the UN get involved in a certain country. So there are constraints and limits from these bodies or institutions. And so it really gives a space for institutions like mine or the International Crisis Group or the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue to sort of step in and play a role.
And you say you founded Beyond Conflict in 1992, is that right?
Correct.
So you have seen, what's that? That's over 20 years. You've maybe seen this build-up of NGOs.
Right.
So, I mean, do you celebrate this sort of growth? Do you think the world is becoming a better place because of these organizations?
Yes and no. Yes, because I think it gives citizens not only just a view, but an opportunity to play a constructive role. The question is, how do you define what is truly civil society? And what is the purpose and real value added of an organization? For example, in the private sector, there'll be a lot of new companies emerging, but they tend to get sort of filtered out pretty quickly if they're not making a profit. In the nonprofit world, you don't have that bottom line as much. And so if they can raise money, they can keep on going without necessarily making a real impact. And so the challenge is how do you find those organizations that are really doing something important, that are really providing value, and at the end of the day, are respected in the countries they're doing work in by all the parties to a conflict?
Can you give us some examples of some of these organizations which are making an impact and how they are doing that?
Well, and I also think it's important to know the distinction between the different approaches. So I think, our organization, Beyond Conflict, we don't do mediation. We do shared experience. We bring in people who had been former enemies or negotiators to come in and share the experience of how they build trust, how they learn to negotiate an agreement, or in the case of South Africa, how the two once former enemies peacefully negotiated the end of apartheid. Many people thought that would be impossible, and yet they did it. Where the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue is about mediation, about going in and not only teaching the capacity of negotiation and mediation, but creating a space where you can get people to talk with each other. And sometimes they're not ready to talk at a particular time, so they'll do a back channel process. So it's less in their case about sharing experience. It's more about doing a particular role or providing a role. And then, of course, the International Crisis Group is really about doing analysis of an emerging conflict and opportunities for preventing it.
And Beyond Borders is very much part of mediation.
They're part of both. They're both mediation and I think shared experience.
And would the neuropsychology of it, taking people who are from conflict situations, bringing them somewhere peaceful like the Scottish borders, can that help talks in a way?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges, for example, in our work, is one of the things we see about human nature, which is particularly visible in countries that have lived under repression or war, is they think their situation is unique, that nobody can learn from others, that nobody can understand what they've been going through. And that's human nature. We become almost very self-centered in our suffering, and we become a victim. We feel that it's not our fault, that it's so not only unique, but so different from anywhere else that we can't learn from them and they can't understand us. And yet what happens is, by being exposed to people from other countries who have been through a similar experience, people slowly start to open up and see the similarity. They realize that we don't have a tradition of compromise, neither did they, but they found a way to do that and come out the other side.
What kind of impact can festivals like Beyond Borders, have in conflict resolution?
Well, it's particularly unique. There are a lot of organizations that will do programs in countries, they'll do workshops, they'll do conferences. But what Beyond Borders has, which is unique, is a setting like Turquoise with all its history. And so it's both a place that can convene people because it's a calling card. I mean, this is so tied to not only Scottish history, but sort of English and British history, that people are both respectful of that and curious about it. It's in a beautiful setting. And Scotland, throughout its history, has had a struggle with its identity and struggle with issues of independence. And not just throughout history, but currently the debate going on right now in the referendum that will be taking place. So that resonates with people around the world. And to see it happening peacefully is a powerful sort of illustration of what's possible.
So you would say that Scotland, because of its turbulent past and because of its present peace, could act as a beacon to other countries, other peoples in conflict?
Well, yeah, I think it's a beacon because it has a history of both violence and seeking its own sense of identity and nationhood. It has a distinct narrative as a nation, different than the others within the British Isles, and yet had been part of this bigger collective good, and yet can fight for peacefully and democratically, possibly independence. And you can see this sort of the struggle and the politics and the campaigning that's going on, and there's no violence associated with it. And I think people need those role models. And so it's both the history and the present that I think make it really powerful right now. And I'll be honest with you, the fact that it's Scotland, if it was a small country in Central America or even elsewhere in the world, it wouldn't have the same resonance that this country has.
Why do you say that? Why? Because it's Scotland?
Well, because Scotland is part of our, not just Western history, but when you think of the Enlightenment, when you think of civil society, it has great sort of intellectual roots and political roots in Scotland, the Scottish Enlightenment. And people aspire to a place that has so much history that resonates globally. The great universities, for good or for bad, the role of the British Empire around the world. So people in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America certainly know Britain, have had a historic connection with it, whether good or bad, in the past. And that gives people a familiarity, which I think creates curiosity, which creates an opportunity.